The first day inside the company felt like a ceremony long prepared by people who believed they were welcoming a subordinate rather than a strategic leader. The receptionist printed my badge with a smile that never reached her eyes, as if she had been instructed to be polite but not warm. The glossy surface of the badge reflected the company's slogan behind me, and for a moment I felt a strange sense of anticipation, the kind that arrives before a change larger than itself. My office was located on the 7th floor, a space with enough windows to make it feel almost symbolic. A desk that looked untouched. Files stacked neatly by someone who thought they understood what my role demanded. A chair angled slightly, as if waiting for the weight of responsibility to settle on it. Colleagues stopped by one after another, each one extending a hand with practiced professionalism. They delivered wholesome greetings, but their eyes betrayed calculation. Some scanned my suit, others measured my posture, all searching for the flaw that would confirm the rumors that had circulated since my name first appeared on the internal announcement. I had been hired to fix a department that had been sliding for years. My arrival threatened internal comfort. People accustomed to mediocrity often fear the presence of accountability, and I could feel the discomfort rising around me like temperature in a closed room. My morning began with a briefing from the outgoing manager. He had already packed his belongings and left a folder on the desk, as if the passing of responsibility could be completed by leaving papers behind. He explained processes with a tone that suggested resignation rather than cooperation. It was clear he had chosen not to adapt to the company's evolving demands, and my presence served as a reminder of the direction he had refused to take. He shook my hand quickly and escaped the room like someone avoiding a mirror. By 10, I was in the main meeting room reviewing innovation reports with senior staff. Most of them avoided asking questions directly, instead whispering observations to one another as if I were a substitute teacher they hoped would disappear by the following week. I listened carefully, took notes, and observed behaviors. A man in marketing kept interrupting others, eager to prove his relevance. A woman in operations avoided eye contact entirely. A financial analyst nodded at everything with a nervous smile that hinted at quiet exhaustion. The department was not broken because of a lack of talent. It was broken because of a culture of silence and mismanagement. When the meeting ended, I returned to my office to draft a preliminary plan. That was when I heard heavy footsteps approaching, not with urgency, but with entitlement. The CEO's son entered without knocking. His shoulders relaxed with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged. His expression carried the kind of self-assuredness only inherited power can produce. He leaned against the doorframe and assessed my office as if inspecting property he believed already belonged to him. The conversation began with a tone of false friendliness. He asked about my commute. He asked about the view. He asked about my impressions so far. But the shift came quickly when he began to critique processes he clearly did not understand. He dismissed my restructuring plan after glancing at it for less than a minute. He attempted to teach me how innovation should work, presenting outdated theories as if they were revelations. He used phrases that implied my role existed only to execute his ideas rather than guide the company's future. I remained calm. Years of professional experience had taught me that arrogance is often loudest when it hides insecurity. I listened, even though nothing he said contributed to progress. His final statement carried weight not because of its content, but because of its intention. He insisted that people like him shaped the future of the company, while people like me implemented the vision of leadership. The message was clear. In his eyes, I was a fortunate employee granted proximity to influence rather than an architect of the company's next chapter. He left the room with a satisfied nod, confident that his authority had been established. I sat quietly, recognizing that this interaction was not an introduction but a warning. He saw me not as a collaborator or strategist, but as a pawn. I reopened my laptop and continued writing my plan, adding a section detailing the immediate structural constraints that would need addressing before any innovation could thrive. I did not allow his presence to interfere with the work required. I had been hired to transform a department, not to seek approval from the inexperienced heir of an empire he had not built. At noon, I received a message instructing me to attend a meeting on the executive floor. I assumed it involved introductions or scheduling coordination. Instead, I found the CEO, 3 board members, and the HR director waiting with expressions carved from cold marble. The CEO began by stating that the company had reconsidered my employment. He claimed that my approach did not align with the company's long-term vision. He insisted that the position required someone with a more adaptable temperament. The HR director slid a folder across the table, already containing termination documents. I had been in the building for 6 hours when the meeting ended. 6 hours, not enough time to execute one project plan, not enough time to establish trust, not enough time to show results. My dismissal was not based on performance, competence, or alignment. It was purely a reflection of ego. The CEO's son believed removing me would preserve his influence. The board agreed without challenge, perhaps out of habit or fear of conflict. I picked up the badge that had been printed that morning and walked out of the building with the same calm I had carried into it. The afternoon air felt different, almost lighter, as if the universe had watched the scene unfold and prepared something larger behind the curtain. I went home, set my briefcase down, and unlocked a drawer containing a folder with thick documentation. Inside were the patents I had spent 3 years developing. Designs, algorithms, mechanical processes, intellectual property registered under my personal holding long before the company even contacted me. When they recruited me, they believed that bringing me in gave them automatic access to those patents. They assumed ownership transferred the moment I accepted the role. They never asked for verification. They never checked legal ownership. They built entire presentations around innovations that were not theirs to claim. They poured resources into planning sessions, investor proposals, and marketing visions based on foundations they did not control. They believed the rights belonged to them simply because they desired them. I opened each document slowly, reviewing every stamp, every certificate, every letter from the patent office confirming my name as the sole owner. These were not mere designs. They were the backbone of future products the company needed to survive aggressive competition. Without them, their projections would crumble. Their strategy would collapse. Their investors would panic. Their entire competitive advantage would evaporate. As the evening progressed, I sat with a calm that felt almost unusual. Most people expect anger after humiliation. They expect resentment, bitterness, outrage. But age and experience reshape reactions. People above 37 know that the most powerful response is often silence. Silence allows clarity. Silence creates opportunity. Silence reveals truth. The company believed they had removed an obstacle. They had no idea they had just dismissed the very person holding the keys to their survival. The next morning, I woke with a sense of direction. Not revenge. Direction. I reviewed emails containing requests to integrate my patented systems into upcoming projects. I examined internal memos that casually referenced my designs as if ownership were a minor detail. Their confidence was astonishing. Their negligence was even more impressive. I organized the files carefully, creating a timeline that demonstrated the extent of their reliance on technology they assumed they owned. By noon, my inbox was full of messages from people inside the company. Some sought clarification. Some sounded nervous. Some attempted to disguise panic as courtesy. I did not reply. Not yet. They had dismissed me without hesitation, and now they were realizing the gravity of their mistake. Power shifts quietly at first, like water rising behind a damaged dam. And in that moment, I understood that the collapse they believed they had avoided by firing me was the very collapse they had triggered. The day they mistook me for someone small became the day they unknowingly handed me complete control of their future. I walked into my home with a sense of quiet that felt heavier than disappointment, yet strangely more purposeful than rage. Most people would have called a lawyer immediately, but I knew the situation required strategy, not noise. The company believed they had closed a chapter by removing me, but I understood that the real story had only just begun. I placed my keys gently on the table, sat down in my study, and opened the laptop that held every detail of the past 3 years. The folder named Core Systems opened with the familiar hum of my machine, revealing the designs that I had protected long before any employment contract had crossed my desk. The first file displayed the blueprint of a platform the company had celebrated as the cornerstone of its future. Investors had applauded it. Engineers had admired it. Leadership had claimed it as their internal breakthrough. None of them knew that every line of code, every technical diagram, every operational flow belonged to me alone. I had created the technology during a period of independent consulting, using resources from my own personal holding, financed through years of careful planning and sacrifice. I had protected the patents meticulously, registering them under a structure that kept ownership entirely in my hands. When the company recruited me, they assumed my work was automatically theirs, as if talent transferred ownership without documentation. I began reviewing each patent certificate with precision, running my fingers over the embossed seals as if reaffirming a promise to myself. The designs included a predictive engine capable of identifying market shifts with remarkable accuracy, an innovation pipeline that could reduce development timelines drastically, and an automation protocol that would have positioned the company at the forefront of its industry. These were not casual inventions. They were the result of sleepless nights, accumulated knowledge, and years spent refining ideas through trial, error, and persistent refinement. I could still recall the excitement that had accompanied the interview process. The board members asked questions with curiosity painted across their faces. They listened intently as I presented a vision for the innovation department. They saw the technical brilliance, but failed to understand the legal boundaries surrounding it. They believed that bringing me in automatically granted them control. Their arrogance blinded them from the basics of intellectual property law, and their negligence created an opening they never recognized until it was far too late. I opened a second tab on my laptop, scrolling through months of internal communication. Email after email referenced my designs as essential components of future development. Engineers had discussed integration strategies. Project managers had drafted outlines that relied heavily on the patented systems. Executives had planned presentations for stakeholders using my data as the foundation of their optimism. Every message served as a record of their reliance and their assumptions, all of which strengthened the legal position I now held. The deeper I went, the more I realized how recklessly they had treated ownership issues. One email from the legal department confirmed the absence of verification regarding patent rights. Another message from an internal strategist listed the improvements expected once my technology was implemented. A memo from the CEO himself detailed timelines dependent entirely on systems the company did not own. Every communication was a thread I could pull later, a thread that would unravel the entire fabric of their decision-making. As I worked, I made sure to document everything carefully. A separate folder named Evidence gradually filled with copies of emails, internal files, meeting summaries, and recordings of project presentations. Not one item contained my signature relinquishing rights. Not one document transferred ownership. The company had acted on assumptions rather than facts. They had built strategy on confidence rather than diligence. They had pushed me out with the belief that I was disposable, never realizing that the technology they depended upon was legally untouchable without my approval. I leaned back in my chair for a moment, letting the weight of realization settle. Silence filled the room, but it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of preparation. People above 37 understand the power of restraint. Younger professionals might rush into battle, eager to prove themselves. Experience teaches a different lesson. Real influence comes from patience and knowledge. Knowing when to speak is important. Knowing when to remain silent is powerful. I resumed my work, organizing everything chronologically. The earliest documents revealed initial excitement about integrating my designs. Later emails showed urgency as deadlines approached. The most recent messages expressed confidence that the company could dominate the market using technology they believed they had secured simply because they had hired me. Their oversight was astonishing. Not once did they question the legal structure behind my work. Not once did they request formal transfer. Not once did they consult external legal counsel. Their entitlement was so deeply embedded that it blinded them completely. When I finished compiling documents, I turned to the recordings folder. I had routinely recorded meetings for note-taking, a habit developed through years of managing complex projects. In one recording, the CEO praised the potential of my designs during a meeting with department heads. He spoke with such certainty that it almost made me smile. He had no idea that the very words he used to impress others would soon become the foundation of consequences none of them were prepared to face. Another recording captured a conversation with the engineering team. They discussed potential modifications to my patented platform, unaware that their suggestions could not legally move forward without permission from the actual owner. A third recording documented a strategy session in which the CEO's son insisted that innovation should follow his instruction. His tone carried the same arrogance that had appeared during our encounter earlier that day. He demanded immediate implementation of an upgrade that could not legally proceed without my involvement. A small part of me wondered how the company had survived this long with such carelessness. Another part recognized that this was not an isolated incident. Many organizations operate under the illusion that talent belongs to them by default. They overlook the possibility that the people they underestimate might possess knowledge and resources the company does not fully understand. In this case, their assumption had created a situation where their entire future depended on someone they had dismissed within hours. The evening moved into night, and the city outside my window grew quieter. Light from street lamps cast long shadows across the room. I brewed a cup of tea and returned to my desk, reviewing the final elements needed for what I knew would come next. My patience was not a strategy born of hesitation. It was a conscious choice to allow the company to feel the first wave of consequences without interference. I knew that when the shock arrived, it would be far more powerful because of my silence. Near midnight, I closed the laptop and rested my hands on the table. I felt no anger, only clarity. The company wanted me gone, believing their decision would protect their hierarchy and preserve the authority of the CEO's son. They did not understand what leaving meant for them. Removing me removed their only legitimate connection to the patents that formed the backbone of their future products. Their dismissal severed that link completely. The technology they depended upon now belonged to someone outside their reach. They had tried to eliminate a problem, but instead, they had eliminated their only solution. The next morning, I woke early and reviewed the files again. The more I studied them, the more I recognized the significance of what I held. The company faced an inevitable setback. They could no longer proceed with development. They could not present progress to investors. They could not release any product based on my designs without facing immediate legal action. Their timeline would collapse. Their revenue projections would fail. Their internal confidence would evaporate. I checked my phone. Several unread messages from senior staff waited in my inbox. Some expressed confusion. Others expressed urgency. A few attempted politeness, thinking it might encourage a response. I placed the phone back on the table without reading further. People often reveal their true values when they believe they are losing control. The sudden shift in tone confirmed that the panic had begun. While I considered the next steps, I reminded myself that true power does not come from retaliation. It comes from understanding leverage. In this situation, leverage belonged entirely to me. The company had created a storm without realizing the sky was already filled with clouds. My silence would act as the turning wind, guiding everything toward the outcome that had already begun forming the moment they fired me. I spent the rest of the morning finishing one final task. I drafted a simple document summarizing the full timeline of events. It included patent registration dates, employment contract limitations, internal correspondences, and reliance patterns. It was not a threat. It was a record. I printed a copy and placed it in a folder labeled Record, knowing that eventually the company would come seeking answers. By noon, I sat in the quiet of my living room, aware that silence was not passive. Silence was preparation. Silence was positioning. Silence was strategy. The company believed they had closed the door on me. What they did not realize was that the door they closed was the only path leading to their future. The silence before the shock was not emptiness. It was the sound of consequences gathering strength. 2 days passed before the first cracks began to appear. At first, the company behaved as though my departure was a minor administrative adjustment. They believed the department could function without interruption, as if restructuring a team or removing a director required nothing more than shifting a few responsibilities. They assumed that because they had fired me with confidence, the flow of innovation would continue without resistance. The illusion lasted until the engineering team attempted to access the core systems and found every portal locked. The algorithms that powered their simulations no longer loaded. The predictive engine displayed an authentication request that no one could bypass. The automation sequences returned errors that none of the technicians could explain. By mid-morning, confusion turned into unease. Meetings that were supposed to showcase progress became silent gatherings filled with anxious glances. The head of engineering tried to present updated timelines to the senior leadership team, but every slide contained gaps. The prototypes that were meant to be displayed remained incomplete. The models that had been used to impress investors could not be recreated because the underlying technology was inaccessible. The atmosphere shifted as executives realized that something far more serious than a staffing issue had occurred. The board gathered quickly, expecting answers from the department heads. They demanded explanations, but no one could provide any that made sense. The files they needed no longer appeared in the internal system. The servers responsible for development had been configured to limit access to owners of the original patents. Because those patents belonged to me, the system treated the company as an external user. Suddenly, the strategy they had built over the past several months unraveled in front of them. What had been presented as a technological breakthrough became an empty shell. The first investor meeting collapsed before it even began. Representatives arrived expecting a demonstration of the company's new capabilities. They left with concerns unspoken only because they were too stunned to articulate them. The next meeting was canceled entirely, and the one after that. Momentum that had taken months to build vanished in less than a day. The board felt the shift immediately, and the sense of pride that had guided their earlier decisions faded into something closer to fear. Legal reached out to me before noon. The tone of their message was carefully crafted, polite enough to remain professional, yet strained enough to reveal panic hiding beneath the surface. They requested a conversation to clarify technical ownership. They suggested there might be a misunderstanding. They asked whether a transfer of rights had already been initiated or whether the documentation needed to be updated. They attempted to present their questions as procedural rather than urgent, but the tension between the lines was unmistakable. I did not respond. An hour later, they tried again, this time with a follow-up that hinted at deeper concern. They used phrases that attempted to soften the urgency, but failed entirely. The legal director assured me privately that the company had no intention of disputing my work. He asked whether I could confirm or deny certain elements of the employment contract. He asked if perhaps the patents were categorized incorrectly. He asked if I could provide a review to help resolve potential conflicts. I left the message unopened for the rest of the day. The next morning, the CEO himself contacted me. His voice no longer carried the authority he had displayed during my dismissal. The confidence he once wielded so easily had faded into cautious uncertainty. He tried to introduce the conversation with acknowledgments about the abrupt events of my first day. He attempted to shift the discussion toward future cooperation. He repeated several times that the company valued my contributions, even though they had fired me without giving me a chance to demonstrate them. He wanted reassurance. He wanted a path back to stability. He wanted anything that could reduce the pressure mounting from every direction. For the first time since I had joined the company, he understood the consequences of acting without verifying facts. Firing a director without reviewing the foundation of the company's most important assets now appeared reckless, even destructive. The CEO's tone reflected that realization. He asked if we could speak. He asked if there was a way to clarify ownership. He asked if I could help the company regain access to what they believed was securely theirs. I did not answer his call. Inside the company, the panic continued to spread. Managers held emergency meetings that produced no solutions. Engineers attempted to rebuild systems from scratch, but quickly discovered that without access to the underlying designs, their efforts were useless. The legal team argued among themselves about liability. Some believed they could negotiate access. Others feared the situation would escalate into a crisis that could threaten the company's future. The board grew restless, demanding explanations from every department head. The CEO's son, who had celebrated my dismissal with a sense of victory, remained silent in the days that followed. His previous confidence had vanished completely. The people who once laughed at his jokes avoided him, sensing that the tide had turned. His influence, once held together by entitlement, began to fracture under the pressure of consequences he did not anticipate. The very hierarchy he depended upon to feel important now viewed him as a liability. Not openly, not verbally, but through the subtle shifts that occur when people distance themselves from someone who has made a costly mistake. By the end of the second day, internal emails revealed the depth of the crisis. Departments reported delays with alarming frequency. Development pipelines stalled. Projects depended on access that no longer existed. The financial team recalculated projections and discovered that the next quarter would look dramatically different without the technological advancements they had promised. Market analysts began questioning the company's ability to remain competitive. Rumors spread among employees, whispering about a decision that had backfired so dramatically it seemed almost unbelievable. Meanwhile, I continued with my routine. I prepared breakfast. I reviewed my personal projects. I organized my schedule. My days were calm, marked by deliberate stillness. The silence was not an act of cruelty. It was simply the rightful consequence of their actions. They had made a choice believing it held no risk. Now they were discovering that choices made in arrogance often lead to outcomes that humility alone cannot repair. Afternoon arrived with another attempt from legal. This time the tone had changed completely. They no longer asked for clarification. They asked for guidance. They invited me to an informal discussion. They offered to accommodate my availability. The message hinted at internal disagreements. Some members of the legal team believed the company should negotiate immediately. Others believed approaching me too quickly would weaken their position. Their uncertainty showed in the way each sentence was constructed. They wanted resolution, but feared appearing desperate. I closed the email without responding. The CEO sent another message later that evening. This one was shorter and more serious. He acknowledged the complexity of the issue. He attempted to explain that the company faced significant pressure from stakeholders. He implied that the situation could escalate. He hinted that the company would prefer an amicable path forward. It was clear he had no interest in conflict. Conflict would expose the company's negligence. Conflict would reveal the carelessness behind their decision. Conflict would show investors and competitors that they had fired the only person capable of supporting the innovations they relied upon. Still, I did not answer. Their silence toward me on the first day had been absolute. They dismissed me without hearing my perspective. They made a decision without requesting clarification. They acted swiftly, believing their authority was enough to silence any objections. Now they stood on the other side of that silence, and it frightened them. The board held another emergency meeting. Voices were raised. Blame shifted from one person to another. The CEO attempted to maintain composure, but struggled as questions multiplied. Investors demanded updates. Partners requested explanations. Market reports predicted potential decline. Competitors began observing the situation with interest. And all the while, the technology at the center of this panic remained inaccessible, protected by the patents they never owned. The company reached a point where pride no longer mattered. Panic had taken its place. Managers who once dismissed new ideas now begged for updates. Departments that once worked independently now rushed to collaborate. The hierarchy, once rigid and proud, now bent under the weight of uncertainty. Every decision made without caution now returned with consequences too large to ignore. Inside my home, the silence remained steady. I allowed their messages to accumulate. I allowed their uncertainty to grow. I allowed them to experience the impact of their own negligence. I did not respond because sometimes the most powerful answer is the one they never expected to receive. Their panic had become louder than their pride, and I had not spoken a single word. The fourth day after my dismissal arrived with a chill that had nothing to do with weather. It came from inside the company's walls, a coldness that spread through departments the moment investors realized the quarterly roadmap had become a hollow promise. Those who had once praised the company's forward momentum were now demanding detailed explanations. They wanted to know why the technology showcased during earlier presentations had suddenly disappeared from internal servers. They wanted tangible proof that progress was still on schedule. What they received instead were vague assurances that lacked conviction. By morning, emails from financial partners flooded the executive office. Some questioned the reliability of the new innovation pipeline. Others requested immediate meetings to reassess investments. The tone varied between formal concern and quiet suspicion. Behind every message was a single unspoken truth. Confidence had cracked, and no amount of polite language could hide the fracture. Inside the building, executives filled conference rooms with the energy of people avoiding a disaster they did not know how to stop. Voices rose. Chairs scraped. Papers shuffled aggressively. The room that once welcomed me with forced politeness now held individuals arguing over timelines and strategies that no longer existed. People who had never acknowledged my presence now felt the consequences of dismissing someone they had not taken the time to understand. The collapse did not come from outside competition. It came from their own assumption that power alone secured success. The CEO entered one meeting with a face drained of confidence. His usual posture, confident and firm, had softened into one marked by uncertainty. He announced that investors demanded a full breakdown of the innovation roadmap. When the engineering director admitted they could not provide one, Because the core technology had been removed, the room fell into an uneasy silence. The CEO turned toward the head of human resources with an expression that revealed the shift already taking shape within the walls. His blame pointed toward the decision to remove me so abruptly. The CEO's son stood beside him, noticeably less confident than he had been during my first day. The arrogance he once displayed had evaporated under the scrutiny of executives who previously praised him without question. He attempted to justify the decision to fire me, insisting that it had been necessary for departmental harmony. His explanation fell apart quickly. Executives questioned why he had interfered with someone hired specifically to lead innovation. Their frustration sharpened as they realized that his involvement had led to the exact crisis unfolding around them. In response, the son directed blame toward human resources. He claimed they had not communicated my role clearly enough. He insisted they had misinterpreted my authority. HR attempted to defend themselves, explaining that they followed instructions from leadership. They insisted their responsibility had been limited to paperwork. Each department pointed fingers everywhere except toward their own actions. The tension inside the room grew thicker, fed by people who suddenly feared appearing responsible. The board held an emergency conference that afternoon. Members gathered with expressions that conveyed calculation and worry. The senior legal officer attempted to outline the patent ownership issue, but the explanation only deepened the confusion. The board asked why no one had verified ownership before integrating the technology into their business model. They asked who approved the decision to proceed without proper documentation. They asked why the company lacked contingency plans. With every question, leadership looked more exposed. In the corners of hallways, employees whispered among themselves, their voices carrying the low hum of speculation. News spreads quickly in corporate environments, especially when silence grows as heavy as a warning. People spoke quietly about the new director who had been fired on the first day. They did not know the details, but they sensed the situation held more weight than leadership admitted. Some recalled the brief introduction they had seen of me. Others remembered my calm expression in the meeting room. They talked about how unusual it had been for the company to remove someone with such authority so quickly. Within hours, rumors evolved into elaborate narratives. Some employees claimed I had taken the patents deliberately as retaliation. Others insisted the company had forced me out without understanding my background. A few believed the CEO's son had created unnecessary conflict. Most simply recognized that something deeper had gone wrong. They did not know the entire truth, but they felt the pressure of changes approaching from all sides. The whispers continued to grow. People mentioned my name as if speaking it clarified the uncertainty around them. They talked about the patents, expressing disbelief that the company had not ensured ownership. They questioned how leadership had allowed such a vital piece of technology to slip through their control. They described the silence filling the offices like the aftermath of a power outage, an unsettling stillness that signaled an impending shift. Meanwhile, investors escalated their demands. Some scheduled meetings with members of the board. Others warned they might withdraw funding if the company could not provide assurance regarding their strategic direction. This pressure extended to partners as well. They questioned the delays. They requested revised timelines. They expressed concern that the company might not meet future obligations. No one wanted to be aligned with a business on the verge of failure, especially one built on a foundation that had now vanished. The CEO attempted to regain control by scheduling an all-department meeting. He hoped transparency would calm employees, but the session only created more confusion. He spoke in general terms, avoiding direct mention of the crisis. People exchanged looks, sensing that he was withholding information. They left the meeting feeling more anxious than before. The CEO's son remained quiet throughout, his usual confidence replaced by shrinking posture and unfocused eyes. In the days that followed, the boardroom became a battlefield. Tension rose with every new piece of information. Each department had attempted to defend their decisions. Some tried to shift responsibility subtly. Others offered complicated explanations that revealed their lack of preparation. The more they spoke, the more the board recognized how deeply the issue extended. They understood that this crisis was not a simple mistake. It was a structural failure rooted in arrogance and negligence. Inside that crumbling hierarchy, professionals with years of experience began to recognize how fragile their positions had become. Some quietly updated their resumes. Others reached out to industry contacts. A few confided in close colleagues, expressing fears about the company's future. Every organization depends on momentum to remain stable. Once momentum reverses, trust dissolved at alarming speed. And while the company struggled to control the narrative, I prepared my own path forward. The documents I had collected were organized into clear sections. One contained communication records. Another detailed patent ownership. A third outlined the company's reliance on my systems. I reviewed each section carefully, ensuring accuracy. These documents were not weapons. They were facts. Facts that would determine the conditions of any future negotiation. I spent time analyzing the company's weaknesses. Their dependence on external partnerships meant they could not withstand extended delays. Their limited innovation pipeline meant they lacked alternatives. Their leadership structure relied too heavily on hierarchy rather than competence. I understood how every piece interconnected, forming a structure that seemed strong from a distance but crumbled easily when pressure was applied. During those quiet hours, I crafted the terms that would rewrite their future. I knew exactly what the company needed. I also knew what I required in exchange. The terms were not designed out of ego. They were built from logic, informed by the recognition that structure, discipline, and accountability were necessary for any lasting progress. As I finalized the initial draft, I felt no desire for revenge. I felt clarity. Companies thrive when leadership respects talent. They fall apart when arrogance guides decisions. The collapse unfolding inside their boardroom confirmed that truth. My silence had become the mirror reflecting their own mistakes, showing them what they had refused to see. By the end of the week, the organization was no longer the confident empire that dismissed me so easily. It was an unstable structure held together only by the hope that I might eventually respond. What they did not realize was that my response would not be rushed. It would be precise, deliberate, and aligned with the value of the work they had taken for granted. Their pride had begun to crumble. And while they scrambled to preserve control, I prepared the terms that would redefine everything they believed they owned. The request arrived early on a Monday morning, delivered through an email so carefully phrased that it almost sounded ceremonial. The board asked to meet me in person, not for a call, not for a statement, not for an apology, a formal meeting. The tone alone revealed the shift that had taken place inside the company. Leaders who once dismissed my presence without hesitation had now reached a point where silence no longer protected them. They needed answers. They needed clarity. Most importantly, they needed access to the patents they had assumed belonged to them. Their authority had been replaced by urgency, and every sentence in the invitation reflected that change. I spent the morning preparing, not through practice or rehearsal, but through quiet reflection. There is a particular strength that grows within a person once they accept that their value does not depend on the opinions of others. The company had treated me as expendable. Now they treated me as essential. I left my home with a calm that felt earned rather than forced. The drive to the building felt different this time. The road seemed clearer. The air felt lighter. It was not triumph. It was alignment. The truth had shifted the balance on its own, and all I needed to do was walk into the moment prepared. As I entered the corporate lobby, the receptionist who had barely acknowledged me on my first day stood up quickly. Her posture held respect that had been absent before. She announced my arrival with a tone reserved for highly ranked visitors. Employees walked past with glances that carried curiosity rather than indifference. A few recognized me and whispered to each other, their expressions a blend of guilt and speculation. The atmosphere suggested they understood I was no longer the new director they had thought would disappear quietly. I had returned as someone whose presence determined their future. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like the slow tightening of a thread. By the time the doors opened, 2 assistants were already waiting to escort me. Their steps were measured, steady, almost rehearsed. They guided me toward the main boardroom, the same room where decisions had once been made without acknowledging my voice. Now, the door that had previously closed on me opened with deliberate care. The boardroom was filled. Every senior member was present, seated in positions that reflected their rank. The atmosphere carried tension, but it was not the loud kind. It was the kind that fills a space after a storm, when people recognize that the damage has already been done and only consequences remain. As I walked in, conversations stopped instantly. All eyes turned toward me. Faces that had dismissed me on my first day now studied every move I made. Some held discomfort. Others held regret. One or two held something closer to fear. I took my seat without speaking. That silence alone shifted the energy in the room. Silence creates pressure that words often cannot compete with. The board members exchanged glances before beginning. The chairman opened the meeting with a tone meant to sound composed. He reviewed the purpose of the gathering, explaining that the company faced a critical moment. He did not mention the firing. He did not mention the arrogance that had shaped that decision. He focused only on the present situation, outlining the challenges that had emerged due to the sudden loss of access to the core technology. When he finished, the CEO spoke. His voice lacked the confidence he once carried with ease. He mentioned the delays. He mentioned the stalled projects. He mentioned the investors expressing concern. He described the mounting pressure from partners demanding updates. His words revealed a landscape filled with uncertainty. The board listened carefully, but their eyes frequently returned to me. They knew the problem. They also knew the solution. The distance between the two grew wider with every passing hour. Finally, the legal director addressed the room. He reviewed the patent ownership issue, referencing documentation that confirmed every detail I already knew. My personal holding controlled the patents. The company had no legal access. Attempts to use the technology without permission would result in immediate consequences. His explanation was careful and precise. The board absorbed the information with expressions that held the weight of unspoken acknowledgement. They understood how deeply they had underestimated the situation. Once the formal explanations ended, the chairman turned toward me. He spoke with deliberate politeness, acknowledging the complexity of the current circumstances. He said the company wished to explore possibilities for moving forward. He mentioned licensing. He mentioned potential partnerships. He mentioned collaboration structures. Each suggestion reflected a desperation that they attempted to disguise with professionalism. I remained silent. They expected questions. They expected concerns. They expected negotiations to begin immediately. Instead, I offered nothing. Silence in a boardroom carries a different kind of force. It creates space where people reveal their truest intentions. The chairman waited a few moments before continuing. He mentioned how valuable my contributions could be. He thanked me for attending. He asked if I was willing to consider solutions. I continued to listen without responding. Other board members joined in. Some attempted empathy by acknowledging the unfortunate events of my first day. Some tried logic by explaining how the company's future depended on collaboration. A few used subtle persuasion, highlighting opportunities for mutual benefit. Each voice carried urgency disguised in professionalism. There was no arrogance left. There was no assumption of superiority. Only need. Their efforts intensified as the silence grew. The CEO's son, who had once spoken to me with entitlement, attempted to contribute. His tone was cautious, almost humble. He suggested a partnership. He said the company could benefit from my leadership. His words were careful, yet his discomfort was visible in his posture. He knew he had played a central role in the crisis. He also knew he could not repair the damage with apologies. Still, I remained silent. The chairman sighed quietly before speaking again. He explained that the company was willing to negotiate terms directly with me. He said they were prepared to consider arrangements that had not been available before. His tone carried the weight of someone recognizing that the balance of power had shifted permanently. Several board members nodded, hoping clarity would emerge soon. The more they spoke, the more the room changed. What had once been a powerful space filled with confident voices now felt like a room waiting for instruction. A sense of realization slowly settled over them. They finally understood that this negotiation would not resemble the meeting where they dismissed me. They could not control the conversation. They could not dictate the terms. They could not determine the outcome. For the first time, they recognized that the future of their company rested in the hands of a person they had treated as insignificant. After a long pause, I raised my eyes and looked at each face in the room. Their expressions shifted slightly, sensing that the silence had meaning. I did not speak. I simply observed. The board members sat upright, waiting for something that would give them direction. The CEO adjusted his tie. The chairman straightened a folder. The legal director held his breath. Even the CEO's son held still, uncertain of what would come next. It was a moment designed by circumstance rather than intention. The power they once believed they possessed had dissolved completely. Only clarity remained. They finally realized that my silence was not hesitation. It was the consequence of their actions. They had removed me without thought. Now they needed me without conditions. The meeting continued for another hour, though very little changed. They attempted once more to outline possible agreements. They asked again if collaboration was possible. They waited for a hint of willingness. I offered none. Instead, I allowed every word they spoke to settle in the air. The silence between us carried more value than any statement I could have offered. When the meeting concluded, the chairman thanked me again. His voice held genuine respect this time. He asked if I would consider their proposals. I gave a single nod and stood. The board members watched as I collected my documents. Some lowered their eyes. Others followed my movements closely, hoping to interpret something that could reassure them. As I left the room, the tension remained behind me like an echo. The company had crossed a boundary they could not reverse. They had entered a negotiation they did not control. And they finally understood that the person they had underestimated now held the future they were desperate to protect. The meeting where I presented my terms did not begin with dramatic speeches or raised voices. It began with a quiet that settled over the room like a warning. Sunlight filtered through wide glass windows, casting long reflections across the polished table. The board members sat with notebooks open in front of them, though none of them seemed willing to write. The CEO's son remained near the end of the table, his usual expression of confidence replaced by an uneasy stillness. The legal director adjusted his tie twice before the chairman invited me to speak. I placed a single folder on the table and opened it without hesitation. Their eyes followed each movement with an intensity usually reserved for critical investor presentations. I presented my terms slowly, clearly, and without emotion. I had no interest in creating drama. Facts alone carried more force than intimidation ever could. The first page outlined the licensing agreement. It granted the company access to the patented systems under strict conditions. It required full financial transparency for any project involving the technology. It mandated documented accountability for every step of the process. The board members leaned forward, their eyes moving carefully across each sentence. I watched their reactions, not out of pettiness, but out of awareness. People reveal their priorities in silence. A few board members looked relieved that an agreement was possible. Others looked troubled by the magnitude of the conditions. The CEO read the text with a tightened jaw. He understood the implications more deeply than anyone else. He knew the company could not survive without my technology. He also knew that accepting my conditions would redefine the authority he had maintained for years. The second part of the proposal addressed leadership restructuring. I stated that the CEO's son would be removed from all strategic roles. This statement shifted the air inside the room. The son's face stiffened, though he did not look up. The chairman exchanged a brief glance with the legal director. The CEO inhaled slowly, preparing himself for a conversation he had hoped to avoid. I maintained a calm tone as I explained that leadership should reflect competence rather than entitlement. I did not mention past behavior. I did not revisit the events of my first day. I allowed the room to recall everything on its own. The third part of the proposal introduced quarterly votes on leadership decisions, with my vote weighted. This point triggered noticeable discomfort in the room. The legal director adjusted his glasses repeatedly, a gesture that betrayed his unease. Some board members leaned back in their chairs, trying to process the shift in power dynamics. Weighted votes meant my influence would surpass that of multiple senior members combined. It meant I would shape decisions that previously excluded my presence entirely. The chairman paused before continuing to read, as if absorbing the full impact of the change. Each section of the proposal had been crafted with precision. I wanted structure, not control. I wanted accountability, not revenge. The conditions ensured stability for the technology one had created while preventing internal chaos from repeating itself. They also eliminated the possibility of future interference from individuals who lacked the discipline required for corporate leadership. The proposal protected both the company and the innovation it depended upon, but it did so through a framework that redefined authority at its core. The board read the proposal line by line. Sweat gathered on the CEO's forehead, forming a thin sheen that caught the light. His breathing slowed, not because of surprise, but because of recognition. He had arrived at a point where pride no longer served him. The decisions made in haste during my first day had brought him to a crossroads he could not escape. The legal director cleared his throat twice, each time attempting to regain composure. The CEO's son remained still, eyes fixed on the table, hands clasped tightly. The arrogance that once shaped his posture had vanished completely. My silence forced them to face the consequences of their actions. I did not raise my voice. I did not remind them of their mistakes. Silence alone carried more weight than any argument. In that room, silence revealed the truth they had tried to ignore. They had fired a man they believed was disposable. Now they needed him more than any executive in the building. They understood that without my cooperation, the company would unravel. The innovation pipeline would collapse. Investors would withdraw. Partners would turn elsewhere. The patent issue had become the center of every decision they made. The chairman eventually broke the silence, asking whether I believed the terms were negotiable. I looked directly at him and allowed the room to absorb the answer without speaking immediately. The tension sharpened. He shifted in his seat, sensing that the question carried more complexity than he anticipated. He asked again, more cautiously, if adjustments could be considered. I responded with a calm explanation that the terms represented the minimum requirements necessary to protect the integrity of the work and the stability of the company. I did not present them as punishment. I presented them as structure. The board murmured among themselves. The legal director whispered suggestions to the CEO. The son remained silent, knowing the conversation concerned him directly. Several board members argued quietly, weighing the consequences of refusal. The chairman requested a brief recess. Everyone stood except me. I remained seated, reviewing my notes, allowing them time to process what needed to be done. They filed out of the room with a sense of urgency that revealed their anxiety. When they returned, their expressions were more structured, as though they had practiced composure during the break. The chairman took the lead, expressing appreciation for the clarity of the proposal. He explained that the board recognized the necessity of a partnership that upheld responsibility. He acknowledged that leadership required restructuring. The CEO remained quiet during the explanation, but his posture shifted into acceptance. The son finally looked up, and the defeat in his eyes made it clear that he realized the consequences of his earlier arrogance. The chairman asked whether I would allow the company to adjust only 1 point. He hoped to negotiate the weighted vote, not to eliminate it, but to discuss the degree. His request was polite, measured, and sincere. I considered it for a moment, then declined without raising my voice. Weighted influence was essential. Without it, the company could easily fall back into the same patterns that had caused the crisis. They needed oversight from someone not bound by internal hierarchy. They needed a voice grounded in logic rather than ego. The chairman nodded slowly, understanding that the refusal was final. The board members exchanged glances before confirming that they would accept all terms without modification. Documents were drafted immediately. The legal director reviewed every line with deliberate care. The CEO signed with a trembling hand, his son watching with an expression caught between disbelief and resignation. Signatures were added one by one. When the final page was complete, the room exhaled collectively. The agreement did not resolve the tension. It reframed it. The company had transformed from a structure that dismissed expertise to one that depended on it. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. The board no longer viewed me as an accessory to their strategy. They now understood that strategy itself depended on my involvement. The CEO's role changed quietly. The son's influence evaporated. Leadership decisions now required transparency and accountability. Every step forward required cooperation, shaped by the terms I had introduced. When I stood to leave, no one moved. They watched as I gathered my documents. Some eyes held gratitude. Others held regret. A few held the weight of realization. I walked out of the boardroom with the calm of someone who had never needed revenge to achieve justice. The proposal had not punished them. It had educated them. The company would survive, but only by adopting a structure built on responsibility rather than pride. Outside the building, the air felt warmer. The noise of the city seemed distant, almost softened by clarity. I did not celebrate. The moment required reflection, not triumph. The conditions I presented had rewritten the power structure, but they had also revealed something deeper. Influence is not given. Influence is earned through competence, timing, and restraint. The company learned that truth the hard way. Their arrogance had collapsed. Their hierarchy had been rebuilt. And for the first time, they understood that dismissing the wrong person can reshape an entire future. As I walked away, I recognized that the agreement marked an ending and a beginning. It ended a period defined by their assumptions. It began a new era shaped by accountability. The power structure had been rewritten, not through force but through clarity. And clarity, when delivered at the right moment, can change everything. The moment the final signature touched the page, an invisible shift passed through the boardroom. It was not loud. It had no sound. Yet it carried the weight of a structure that had finally acknowledged its own fragility. The agreement lay on the table between us, a collection of terms that reflected the company's dependence on the technology they once believed they controlled. The board members rested their pens beside the documents with a weariness that came from long days of denial turning into acceptance. The atmosphere in the room had changed. Every executive present understood that authority had moved silently from their hands into mine. The next days unfolded with a quiet transformation. The CEO, a man who had held his position for years with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, found himself facing mounting pressure from inside the company. Investors demanded accountability for the mismanagement that led to the crisis. Partners questioned the leadership decisions that had jeopardized critical projects. Members of the board argued during private discussions, each trying to salvage their reputation. The CEO had become a symbol of the organization's failure to recognize value when it appeared right in front of them. He stepped down during an emergency meeting, leaving the company with a brief announcement that lacked the pride he once carried so easily. Once his resignation became public, the internal landscape changed quickly. Executives who had spent years aligning themselves with his leadership suddenly shifted into new patterns. Some distanced themselves. Others whispered that the resignation had been inevitable. The board wasted no time appointing an interim leader, someone known for stability rather than ambition. The transition was quiet but deliberate, guided by the recognition that the old foundation could no longer support the weight of the company's future. The CEO's son faced a different outcome. His removal from strategic roles had been written into the agreement he could not escape. When the announcement circulated internally, employees reacted with a mix of surprise and satisfaction. His influence had once dominated meetings through charm and privilege rather than expertise. Now he walked through the hallways with a posture that no longer carried authority. Some avoided eye contact. Others watched him with silent judgment. He had become a reminder of the arrogance that had brought the company to the edge of collapse. Without official power, his presence shifted from dominance to discomfort. Meanwhile, the board began reorganizing its structure. Members who had participated in the decision to fire me faced increased scrutiny. Some chose to retire early. Others redirected their responsibilities. A few attempted to rebrand themselves as advocates of accountability, though their efforts appeared forced. The internal culture, once defined by unchallenged confidence, now revolved around caution. People whispered less. They listened more. Meetings that had once echoed with certainty now contained long pauses where individuals considered the consequences of each statement. Throughout all of this, I remained in the background, observing from a distance. I did not attend the meetings where executives debated their futures. I did not participate in discussions about the company's reputation. I let the natural progression of events unfold while reviewing documents, analyzing steps, and ensuring that every term of the agreement was honored. Revenge did not require anger. It required structure. It required consistency. And most importantly, it required patience. The patents they once tried to claim had become the very tool I used to take control of their future. The irony was not lost on me. They had fired me thinking I was simply an inconvenience. They had believed that removing me would preserve their decision-making hierarchy. Instead, it had opened the door to a negotiation that reshaped the entire direction of the company. Not through confrontation, not through accusation, through documents, through signatures, through the undeniable logic of ownership. The company began integrating the systems again once the agreement took effect. Engineers approached the work with a different attitude. They had seen what happened when assumptions replaced diligence. They documented each step carefully. They requested feedback with genuine respect. They checked every decision with a level of caution that had previously been absent from their process. The department responsible for innovation shifted from chaotic enthusiasm to structured discipline. The change was subtle yet profound. Partners responded positively once news of the new structure reached them. They appreciated the return to stability. They welcomed the clarity introduced by the licensing terms. Several expressed relief that the company had acknowledged its mistakes instead of attempting to conceal them. Investors noted improvements in communication. For the first time in months, confidence began to return. Projects that had been stalled moved forward cautiously but steadily. The roadmap that once seemed impossible slowly regained shape. Throughout the process, I rarely spoke publicly. I allowed the documents to speak in my place. The agreement outlined expectations clearly. The company now followed those expectations with precision. Some executives attempted to discuss future collaborations. Others asked for additional insights. I responded only when necessary. Silence became my most effective tool. Silence reminded them that value does not require volume. Silence emphasized that every privilege they had regained came from a structure they once ignored. During internal meetings, the board often referenced the agreement. They discussed transparency with a sincerity that had not existed before. They analyzed decisions through careful evaluation rather than instinctive confidence. The removal of the CEO's son created space for new voices to rise, voices grounded in competence rather than family ties. The interim leader focused on rebuilding trust within departments. Slowly, the company began to heal from the consequences of its own actions. I continued to observe everything with steady distance. The transformation was not about personal victory. It was about clarity. Revenge, when fueled by anger, becomes impulsive. But revenge built through documents and timing becomes something different. It becomes correction. It becomes direction. It becomes a reminder to everyone involved that actions have consequences even when those consequences arrive quietly. My relationship with the board evolved into one defined by mutual respect. They understood my role. They understood the boundaries that could not be crossed again. They recognized that the company's future depended on honoring agreements with integrity. Some members expressed gratitude for my patience. Others apologized indirectly by committing to improved standards. I accepted their efforts without encouraging familiarity. Professionalism created the distance necessary for stability. Every signature placed on those documents remained a reminder that real power does not fight. Real power waits. It waits while others argue. It waits while others panic. It waits while the truth reveals itself. Power is not measured by volume or aggression. It is measured by the ability to remain calm when others lose control. It is measured by the discipline to act only when the moment is right. It is measured by the understanding that influence grows quietly when it is supported by knowledge and patience. As the company regained its footing, I reflected on the events that had shaped the journey. I remembered the day they fired me. I remembered the dismissive expressions. I remembered the arrogance that filled the boardroom. And I realized that nothing I had done since then came from the desire to harm them. Everything came from the need to correct a structure that had collapsed under its own pride. Paperwork had become my voice. Timing had become my ally. Patience had become my strategy. The company transformed not because I forced it to, but because truth created pressure they could no longer ignore. My conditions had provided a roadmap toward responsibility. Their signatures had confirmed their willingness to follow it. Soon the company operated with more discipline than ever before. Departments communicated more effectively. Leaders made decisions with greater thought. Innovation progressed with caution and accuracy. In the end, the revenge they feared never arrived. What arrived instead was transformation. A transformation built quietly. A transformation built logically. A transformation built through the recognition that respect and competence must guide every decision. Real power did not need sound. It did not need force. It moved silently through documents, timelines, and patience. And when it finally reached the boardroom, it changed everything without raising a single voice. Walking out of the boardroom that afternoon felt unlike anything I had imagined during the weeks leading up to that moment. There was no surge of triumph, no rush of adrenaline, no need to pause in the hallway and savor the victory. I simply stepped into the elevator with a calm that wrapped itself around me like a well-worn coat. The polished doors closed quietly, and the hum of the machinery softened the tension that had built inside the room behind me. I did not smile. I did not sigh. I felt aligned with reality in a way that only experience can produce, a feeling that grows when a person finally understands the difference between reaction and strategy. The elevator descended slowly, as if mimicking the gradual shift that had occurred inside the company. When I reached the lobby, employees moved around me with a mix of curiosity and caution. Some recognized me and quickly looked away, realizing the rumor that had traveled through hallways for days had finally crystallized into truth. Others watched discreetly, unsure how to interpret the presence of someone who had walked in as a new director and now walked out as a figure whose influence surpassed every senior executive in the building. I felt none of the eagerness that accompanies youthful success. Instead, I felt the grounded certainty that arrives when life teaches its most important lessons through unexpected challenges. Stepping outside, the late afternoon air carried the warmth of fading sunlight. Cars passed along the street with the steady rhythm of a city accustomed to constant motion. I paused for a moment, not to reflect on the past, but to acknowledge the present. Everything had unfolded not through confrontation, but through preparation. Not through anger, but through patience. Not through noise, but through documents that spoke louder than raised voices ever could. These realizations do not come easily to those who have not lived long enough to see the consequences of haste. They belong to those who understand that stepping back often holds more power than stepping forward. For anyone over 35, life teaches an essential truth. Power is not volume. Power is preparation. Power is the quiet work done long before anyone is watching. Power is the ability to stand firm in who you are even when others underestimate your value. The company had believed they could shape their future without accountability. They believed authority alone would protect them. They believed removing me would resolve discomfort. But experience teaches that arrogance is fragile. The moment pressure arrives, arrogance collapses, revealing the foundation beneath it. In this case, the foundation was built on assumptions that crumbled as soon as facts emerged. My patents had not been created in response to conflict. They had been crafted years earlier through discipline, sacrifice, and a desire to build something meaningful. They represented nights of research, hours of refinement, and a determination to create systems that would outlast temporary setbacks. When the company fired me on my first day, they believed they were discarding someone insignificant. They had not imagined that the very work they depended upon belonged entirely to the person they had tried to dismiss. They did not understand that ownership, when protected with clarity, becomes the strongest form of defense. As I walked toward my car, I thought about how often people misunderstand revenge. Many imagine it as destruction, a dramatic collapse orchestrated with anger. But true revenge, the kind that resonates with people who have lived long enough to recognize patterns, is never about chaos. True revenge is clarity. Clarity exposes what arrogance tried to hide. Clarity reveals the difference between illusion and truth. Clarity returns every action to its rightful origin. In this situation, clarity had done more than any argument could. It showed the company who they had underestimated. It showed them the cost of impulsive decisions. It showed them the weight of consequences that had been quietly waiting for recognition. I drove home through evening traffic, surrounded by the steady flow of people heading toward their own routines. Life outside the corporate world continued unchanged. That contrast reminded me once again that victories built on wisdom do not require celebration. They require understanding. The company's leadership had believed their authority was unshakable. 30 days later, those same leaders had signed documents that placed me in a position they never imagined granting. Their signatures reflected more than agreement. They reflected acknowledgement. They reflected acceptance of truths they had ignored until the consequences arrived. When I entered my home, the familiar stillness welcomed me like an old friend. I placed the signed documents on my desk, not as trophies but as reminders of alignment. They represented preparation. They represented discipline. They represented the strength of quiet consistency. I sat down and allowed myself to breathe deeply, absorbing the reality that had unfolded with precision rather than force. Nothing about the process had required raised voices. Nothing had required confrontation. Everything had unfolded through knowledge, documentation, and time. People over 35 understand that time reveals what impulsive reactions try to hide. Time exposes weaknesses. Time rewards patience. Time punishes carelessness. The company had rushed to remove me without understanding the foundation beneath their decision. They had not considered the legal structure of the technology they relied upon. They had not reviewed the patents they assumed belonged to them. They had not questioned the consequences of treating someone as replaceable. Their failure had nothing to do with my presence. Their failure had everything to do with their assumptions. I reflected on the younger version of myself, the one who would have responded immediately with anger or frustration. Experience changes that instinct. Life teaches that emotional reactions rarely create long-term results. Silence does. Documentation does. Preparation does. I remembered nights spent studying contract law, mornings spent organizing files, afternoons spent refining systems. Those efforts had seemed unrelated to anything significant at the time. Yet they had created the framework that protected me when the company tried to treat me as insignificant. The irony was subtle but powerful. They fired me on day 1. I became their owner by day 30. Ownership is not always literal. Ownership can be influence. Ownership can be control over direction. Ownership can be the ability to shape decisions that were once denied. I had not sought ownership intentionally. It had emerged naturally through the combination of preparation and circumstance. The most meaningful victories are often those that form without force, guided by alignment rather than ambition. As the evenings settled into night, I reviewed the agreement once more. Each line reflected the lessons I had learned over the years. Protect your work. Protect your name. Protect your rights long before someone tries to take them. People often mistake confidence for power. But real power is not loud. Real power is silent because it does not need validation. Real power comes from understanding the rules better than the people who attempt to manipulate them. Real power grows slowly, built through decisions made with intention. I closed the folder and placed it in my cabinet. I felt no urge to frame it or display it. I wanted my life to move forward without being anchored by the events that had led to this moment. Success does not always demand recognition. Sometimes the quietest success carries the deepest impact. I understood that I did not need applause. I did not need acknowledgement from the people who had dismissed me. I only needed alignment with my own principles. Before going to bed, I stepped outside for a moment. The night sky stretched across the horizon, filled with stars that continued shining without seeking attention. That image captured the essence of everything I had experienced. Influence does not need sound. Strength does not need display. Truth does not need force. It only needs patience. The next morning, I woke with a sense of clarity that matched the stillness of the night before. Life had returned to its natural pace. The company continued its restructuring. The board implemented the terms. The executives adjusted to the new reality. I continued my work with the same discipline that shaped my path long before this conflict began. Nothing in my environment demanded urgency. Nothing required retaliation. Everything moved toward stability. For anyone over 35, this simple truth becomes the cornerstone of resilience. Power is not noise. Power is preparation. Power is owning your work and your rights before anyone tries to claim them. Power is the quiet confidence that grows from patience rather than anger. The corporate world often rewards volume, but the real decisions are shaped by the quietest person in the room, the person who holds the documents that determine the fate of everyone else. I walked out of that boardroom without celebration because the victory had already taken place long before I stepped inside. It had taken place during the years I spent preparing myself. It had taken place during the moments when others underestimated me. It had taken place every time I chose patience over reaction. The victory did not need applause. It only needed patience.